Hi, I'm Dustin George, and you're listening to the Caretaker's Journey podcast.
Welcome to today's meaningful conversation. I am your host, Carole and we are in part 2, unpacking the idea of suffering. And I am so excited. Last week, we talked about why God allows suffering and just sort of talked about what suffering is. And this week, we're going to unpack some biblical aspects of suffering. And Dustin George is joining me today. He is a lead pastor, a writer, a conference speaker. He has served for nearly 2 decades in various pastoral positions across all age ranges. Before entering full-time church ministry, Dustin taught high school English for 10 years. And in his free time, Dustin can usually be found fly fishing in the Smokies, which is so beautiful, expanding his skills as a craftsman, or enjoying his next adventure. And I am so excited to be friends with Dustin and his wife, Rebecca, because I get to be kind of a bird's eye view of their adventures, and they have lots of them. He and his wife, Rebecca, live in East Tennessee, and I am so excited to welcome you back to the show for part 2 of Suffering, Dustin.
Thanks for having me back.
As I told you guys last week, I've always wanted to do this podcast because I get asked these same questions, and I'm going to tell you what these questions are again. If you haven't listened to episode 1, you need to go back and listen to it. But what happened or what brought this about in my mind is, number one, I am one who is just totally and completely committed to authenticity and transparency. And I am going to attack the hard topics. And I want to unpack the things that most people don't want to talk about or even deal with. And so when my husband first began to struggle, there were questions that people just kept asking me and have continued to ask me over the past 10 years that we've been dealing with his mental illness. The first question is, how could this happen to Bill? And that was so hard because people who knew him just knew that this was not something that none of us saw this coming in his life. The other question was, why did God allow or do this to Bill? And the third question, which is why I kind of get to this point, because I think the first 2 questions lead into this question, why does God allow suffering? And I think that I love that we're tackling this topic, Justin, because as a pastor, because we were pastors for many years, I know that this is a topic that comes up. And I'm sure you have been asked the same question. Why does God allow suffering? So last week we talked about the thoughts on suffering. And today our conversation is going to be biblical understanding of suffering and how God uses suffering too. And this is a hard one because we don't want to think that the suffering in our life God can use it for something. And yet, how sad would it be if he didn't? So let's talk about this today, Dustin. First, let's talk about the biblical understanding of suffering. And I pulled 4 things out. You say God's ways are perfect. God has all the power. God has perfect knowledge. Let's just start unpacking. There's several of them. Let's just go to the first one. God's ways are perfect.
Okay. Well, and first of all, and as you encouraged your listeners to go back and listen to the episode before this one, because it'll make much more sense, the context.
Yes, it will.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about last episode was that sometimes people deny the existence of God because of suffering. They say suffering exists, therefore God cannot exist. I had a young lady years ago, when I was working in student ministry, she said that she was an atheist. And she said, I do not believe in God because they're suffering. And then she proceeded to go on a rant toward God. And I let her go for 3 or 4 minutes talking about how much she dislikes God and how unfair he is and how this he is. And finally I looked at her and I said, I thought you were an atheist. And she said, I am an atheist. And I said, do you believe in unicorns? And she said, what does that have anything to do with you? I said, do you believe in unicorns? She said, well, of course not. I said, do you also go on rants about unicorns? Like you're going on rants about a God you don't believe in? She's like, well, unicorns don't exist and neither does God. And I said, yet you rant about this non-existent being. I said, if God doesn't exist, then why waste your time griping about him? Just go about your day. Just as I don't If someone came to me and said, I don't believe in unicorns, which I don't believe in unicorns, but if somebody said, well, I don't believe in unicorns, but I'm telling you, you know what our problem? Our problem is the unicorns. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
those dirty, stinking unicorns, they're the issue. You would think this person was out of their mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this presupposes, first of all, God does exist, and he
Right.
does, all right, and then you have to ask questions about his character, and because suffering,
Mm,
sometimes people say, if God exists and suffering exists, then that means God can do something about it, but he
yes.
doesn't, or God can do something about it and he is or maybe doesn't see it coming, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
God can't do anything about it and he is just as helpless and hapless as we are. Well, none of those are true.
Wow. That is
um,
correct. None of those are
so
true.
the first idea is that God's ways are perfect. And if we're going to approach suffering, we have first, and in light of who God is, we have to say his ways are perfect. And this is what the Bible says. I mean, this is how the Bible self attests um, to God. Psalm, this is chapter 18, verse 30. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him.
Mm,
Deuteronomy 32:4. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. All his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. So, biblically, God's ways are perfect. We
mm-hmm.
may not understand them, and he even lays that out, right? That his ways
Mm-hmm.
are above our ways, or are not our ways. His thoughts are above our thoughts. But then, secondly, God has all power.
Yes.
So God is omnipotent. You have that question asked that the understood answer is yes or no. I'm sorry. Genesis 18:14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? We understand
Mm-hmm.
that yes, God is all powerful, and no, nothing is too hard for him. Even Job, even Job. Um, in that we talked last episode about Job suffering. Job 42:2. I know that you, he's speaking to God, I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. So God can do all things. God has all power. So,
Mm-hmm.
which seems to fly in, well, it does fly in the face of those that say that God is incapable of doing something, right, about suffering. And then finally, you'd mentioned that God has perfect knowledge. He knows all things. Psalm 147, verse 5. Great is our Lord and mighty in power. There's the power again. His understanding is infinite. So there's nothing that gets by him.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to approach God and you're going to approach the idea of suffering, those are some things that you need to have in place first biblically.
Yeah.
Is he's perfect in all of his ways. He has all power. He has all knowledge. So
Yeah.
you have to start there.
Yeah. And really it that's kind of what the beginning of our personal relationship with God really is. It
Mm-hmm.
starts with understanding that these three things, he's perfect, he has power, he has knowledge. And when we step back and realize, I look back over my life and all of the things that have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to ask the question, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? And somewhere along the way, when I got into a relationship with God and understood these things, he's perfect, he's powerful, he has all knowledge, I began to change the question. And especially over the last few years with my husband's mental illness, I don't ask, why is this happening? I say, okay, this is happening. Now what?
Mm-hmm.
What
Yes.
am I supposed to do?
Right.
And that's really where this whole Caretaker's Journey ministry, the podcast, everything was born out of that question. This is a part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And really, when I started looking back, I began caretaking at 9
Mm.
with my mom and my siblings. And it's not stopped. And it's
Mm.
just kind of picked up speed since then. And now I sit here and I look and I say, oh, all of these things help me understand because I feel it. I know what it's like to
Mm-hmm.
be in the trenches of caregiving. And I laugh because somebody said to me, well, I don't know if there's a market for this. And then I laugh again and go, well, there's 55 million of us. And so the thing that really comforts me is there is not one moment where God says, oh, I didn't see that coming.
Sure. Right.
There's not a moment. There is not a point in time where God will say to you, "Oh, girl, I'm so sorry. I didn't see that coming."
It's like that old saying that has it ever occurred to you that nothing has ever occurred to God?
I
Right?
love that. I
I mean,
love
and
that.
think about that. Think about in the caretaker's journey that you have walked. If any one of those three things we just mentioned were not true,
Oh,
if you had to face what you have faced and you said, you know what, I'm facing all these things, but God's not perfect in all his ways, or I'm
mm,
facing these things except God doesn't have the power, or I'm facing these things, and as you just said, there's some things that God he missed.
yeah,
Can you imagine?
no, I can't.
I mean, any
I can't.
one of those.
And to be honest with you, there has not been one moment since the morning after I left my husband in a psychiatric hospital, and I didn't know where he was. I didn't know what they were doing to him. I had no power. I couldn't call and check on him because I didn't know where they were taking him.
Mhm.
And there was about 48 hours where I did not know where he was. And there is not one moment where I have not questioned or said, God, you messed up.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now I have gotten angry and said, really, you think I'm this strong? I mean, I've thrown some epic fits because I can throw some pretty good, I can throw a pretty good fit, but never, ever, ever have I forgotten that God is perfect, that he has
Mm.
power, and that
Yeah.
he knows
True.
exactly. And he has over and over and over again shown up
Mm.
in my journey as a
Mhm.
caretaker. So let's move on to this idea that our eternal relationship does not eliminate our temporal suffering.
That's an unpopular statement
I
for so many
know.
people today.
I know. And some people are going to turn it off right now.
I
In
know
fact,
some
two
people
weeks
are going to
ago,
go,
2 weeks
no.
ago, I did I interviewed someone called Sacred Scars. She wrote a book called Sacred
Mhm.
Scars, and it is the most beautiful picture of how our scars are a reminder of what God is doing in our
Sure.
life.
Yes.
And I lost followers. I was
because
seeing people unsubscribe,
because of the
and
pain,
yet it's one of my
because they
most
didn't, is it because they didn't want to they didn't want to embrace human suffering as
maybe
a
maybe
okay.
they want to ignore it. But I think this is a hard question because we think because our eternal relationship with God is secure
Sure.
that it should eliminate our
Should
temporal
eliminate.
suffering,
So
and
here's the verse.
it doesn't.
Here's a couple of verses that I go to, right? Philippians 1:29.
Good one.
For it has been granted,
I
let's
love that
time
word.
out.
Granted.
Granted,
I love
given,
that.
gifted, gifted to you
Mm-hmm.
as an act of grace.
Ooh,
It has been granted to you. Let's finish. It has Philippians 1:29. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him but also suffer for his sake. Okay,
mm,
wait a minute. Time out. And the idea of I was preaching on the idea of for my namesake, how God mentions that in the Bible and back in the Old Testament, and the idea of for Christ's namesake or for the sake of Christ. That word "sake," it's a word that when you look at it, it means the earliest form of it, especially in the Old Testament, goes back to sing, to shout, to announce, to testify,
yes. Yes.
and to testify something of the character.
Mm,
And so here we have Paul saying, for the sake of Christ, to sing, to shout, to testify, to announce, to proclaim something of the character of Christ, it has been gifted to you to
yes.
suffer
Yes.
for his character, for his name's sake. I mean, that's there.
Mm-hmm.
And some people, I find it odd that some people try to circumvent that and they say, no, 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 that does that doesn't work. Well, it's like when you find that the apostles run into difficulty and they are they're persecuted and all sorts of other stuff, and then they make the statement that it's through that pain and it's through many tribulations that we enter the kingdom. It's like,
Ugh.
wait, what? Like
Mm-hmm.
that is part and parcel of the whole redemptive plan is now human suffering. Um,
Yeah.
that it becomes a redemptive force. And in the words of Jesus, John 16:33, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So our eternal relationship, it
Yeah.
doesn't eliminate our temporal suffering, but it redeems our temporal
Yes.
suffering. So
Yes.
there's a huge difference in that. It doesn't eliminate it, but it
It kind of
changes the
gives us,
context of it.
oh, totally. And it kind of leads into the next point, which is God works his purpose in
Mm,
all things, including our suffering.
absolutely.
And I think that's hard for us because we don't want to have this picture of God using suffering. And really what we're talking about kind of flies in the face of the prosperity gospel, because
Hmm.
when you follow prosperity gospel, what you're doing is you're drawing a line in the sand that says, well, if I'm blessed, then I'm going to prosper. But
Sure.
if I'm suffering, then I must have done something to make God mad. And that is another question that I have been asked. What
Mm,
did you do to make God so mad at you?
mm,
And I'm like, not quite sure.
mm.
Not quite sure that I even understand or believe, you know, because I'm a sinful person. I'm not perfect, and I need a redeeming God.
Sure.
And so, I don't know. So let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah, that God works
How
his
does he?
purposes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
Well, it reminds me there was one of the churches I served at years ago. There was a woman in a Wednesday night Bible study. She was talking to me. I think I had preached on a topic of suffering in that Bible study. She came up to me and she had been recently diagnosed with kind of a strange, almost necessarily rare, but it was not that common a form of cancer. And they were trying to give her treatments, and she wasn't really responding as well as they had anticipated or well as they had hoped. And some other person at the same church, large church, came to my friend and just said, again, Job's comforters came to her and said, have you ever
Gotta love
wondered
those.
why God let this happen to you? And she said, my initial thought was, I'm very angry at this question.
Mm-hmm.
She said, but then I looked at the person and I said, no. The question that I would ask is, why not?
Yeah.
Why not? What makes me special? What makes
Mm-hmm.
me think I'm exempt? Why would you think you're exempt? And so she turns it around and starts talking to this
Mm-hmm.
individual and says, and then she ended with, but I know that God can work this for his purposes. And that
Mm-hmm.
goes back, we quote this a lot, right? Romans 8:28.
Yes.
And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Well, but it says all things work together for good, meaning
Mm-hmm.
not all things are good. They work
Right.
together for good. And that's the other aspect of it. If you take your suffering by itself and you don't put it in the overall redemptive context of God,
Right.
then you
Right.
have this little island of pain out there by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else is on the map. It's just out there, and that's all that occupies that topography of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's not going to make sense, at least not to you.
Right.
But when you
Right.
realize that God works all things together, the good, the bad, the light, the dark, the
Mm-hmm.
difficulty, the joys. He weaves all of that together for good, for a larger redemptive purpose that we can't get our heads around because we're
That is
finite created
oh,
beings.
so good.
Not only finite created beings, finite fallen beings
Mm-hmm.
that are redeemed, and we're in the process of sanctification. But we do not fully comprehend the reality, the spiritual reality that is at work around us.
Mm-hmm.
We don't fully understand that. We can't fully
Yeah.
understand God's ways. And
Right.
so with God, he's going to take all things and he's going to work them together. And he works them together. It's not worked in solitary fashion. The
Right.
other thing about this, about God's purpose in suffering, then you have to ask the question, if someone says nothing good can come out of suffering, how can God work his purpose through the suffering? My default is, well, then you're denying that the cross of Christ, the
Oh,
worst day in
of his
all
life.
of human history, the
Mm-hmm.
God man himself, fully God, fully man,
Mm-hmm.
dies on the cross for our sins. And
Yeah.
and we're saying, well, no good can come out of suffering and pain. Well, hello, wait just a moment. You're dealing with the worst possible suffering, not just physical
Yeah.
suffering, spiritual suffering, and bearing the wrath of his father.
Yeah.
And we're saying no good can come of suffering. The ultimate good, the darkest day of human history was actually the most incredible act of redemption that we've ever seen. So,
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the idea that we don't understand,
mm,
and we try to we go back to that picture that I talked about last week, where we put that picture on the wall of
hmm
what we believe God is, who he is, what he thinks, and how he I mean, we start to presume that we know how God thinks,
right,
and what we're doing is we're just superimposing onto that picture and idea of him what we want him to be.
sure,
And 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 then when it doesn't turn out that way, it's hard. It's
mm,
really hard. And yet I can honestly testify, there's no other word to say, I can honestly testify that God has used every horrible thing in my life, my abusive alcoholic father,
mm,
my abusive narcissistic mother, my controlling husband, who
hmm
I am still married to. We're about to celebrate 48 years of
oh,
marriage.
congratulations.
And the odds of us making it through, if you read my book, the odds of us making it through what we have been through in the last 10 years are so small, but it's only because I
Mm,
go back to that relationship to God and I don't try to understand why. I just say, this is happening. What am I supposed to do?
sure, and
What
even
am I supposed
and
to
even
do?
in the midst of that pain, right?
Yeah.
That was one thing that I had sent you that we looked at, that the purpose of Christ is more important than the absence of our pain.
Oh, so true.
That
So, so
we
true.
have there's a greater purpose that's at play and that is at work, that is working in us a greater glory, and the pain, no matter how
Mm-hmm.
intense, no matter how hard it is, it's worth it.
Yeah.
You're very close with my wife Rebecca,
Yes.
and when Rebecca and I were we were engaged, we hadn't gotten married yet, and I was going to go to Memphis and watch her run the Memphis half marathon. So she was still living in Knoxville, and we were going to meet in Memphis, and I was going to watch her run the marathon. Well, so she had trained,
Mm-hmm.
she had eaten right, she had done all this stuff, and so here I am, right, and I'm more of the slow athleticism. Like I will pick up heavy things, I'll hike,
That's me.
yeah,
I'm not a
right. I
runner.
mean, I'm not a runner. I
No.
told people that's why I became a black belt and then an instructor in martial arts, was so I don't have to run.
You don't
Right?
have
Like
to run.
I'm not gonna. I
Ah.
don't want to. I would rather just stand and fight you. I'm not gonna run, for goodness sake. No, I hate running that much. But
I'm going to be a possum. I'm going to just lay
right,
down and
just gonna
play
lay
dead.
down and play dead. And so we're in Memphis, and Rebecca runs, and they have little chips inside of their running
Yes.
bibs,
Yes.
so that if you download the app, you can look real
Yeah.
time as to where whatever particular runner is on the course. So we're in Memphis, right? Downtown Memphis. They're running all through downtown Memphis. And so Rebecca's running, and I'm looking at my phone and I'm seeing where she is. And so I'm like, I got time. I want to meet it. I want to go over here to this corner and cheer her on, but I got time to stop and get some barbecue here in Memphis. So I'm dead serious. So I would go and I would eat a barbecue sandwich. And then on my way, I would like, can I get this to go? And I would get the barbecue sandwich and I'd start eating it and I'd drink my sweet tea. go down to the corner. I'm like, yay, yay, holding up my barbecue sandwich. Yeah, run, babe. You got it. You got this. Yeah, great job. Then I eat, and then I'm like, well, I got time to go to the Peabody and get one of those little key lime pies that they have downstairs in the dessert area, right? And down the mezzanine, down the lower level, I got time for that. So I'd go get a key lime pie, sit there, eat my key lime pie. Then I would go, okay, I'm gonna, I'm looking at my watch, I'm looking at my phone, and I'm like, go to another corner. Like, yay, you're great, you're doing great. While I'm wiping key lime
pie of your
graham
beard.
cracker crumbs from my beard. And so I finally find out, okay, I'm looking at where she is. And so I look at where the finish line is, and I go to the finish line. And here I am full of key lime pie and barbecue and sweet tea. And they've got music playing. And of course, they're looking at the same app in the grandstand or in the announcer stand that I'm looking at. So they can say, rounding the bend down at the end of the street, there's runner number 535. It's, insert, John Doe, and he's breaking his personal best time. Da, 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 da. Everybody's going crazy and the band's playing and there's all this excitement. And I'm getting so caught up in this. And I'm thinking, this is really kind of cool. I'd never seen the finish line at one of these places. And I'm thinking, and I'm still waiting on Rebecca. And I'm like, this is so much enthusiasm and just love and just everybody's just, and then I see this guy run in, and he's got this pained look on his face, and he comes running in. He crosses the finish line. He throws his arms up, and then he throws up all over himself.
Yep.
And I was like, okay. And then a few minutes later, a guy runs through, collapses. They put him in a wheelchair, and they kind of cart him off. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do that, right? But then Rebecca runs through. And she's, she's exhausted, and she's like all pale, and she's sweaty, and she's trembling, and we have to get some carbs into her and everything. And I'm sitting there looking at this, and I'm thinking, you have a wall, like a holder, a wall, a display of medals, of ribbons, of trophies, of certificates that show you have done this not once, but multiple times.
Yeah.
I'm watching people throw up, and I'm watching people collapse. Why on earth? But the purpose that she was trying to accomplish was worth all of that difficulty and all that pain. Yes. Here I was. I'm not experiencing that purpose.
Right.
I'm experiencing the luxury, right, of key lime pie, barbecue sandwiches, and sweet tea in Memphis. I'm not on the field. I'm not on the track. I'm not running. I did not get a ribbon for barbecue eating that day. Could have made one, but did not get one. And in the same way, when people say, I don't understand how the pain can have purpose, when you're in it, and you see it redeemed, and you understand biblically that God is in the work of redeeming our worst, darkest days for his glory, then you recognize his glory, his purpose is worth any amount of pain.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And this kind of leads into the topic that we're going to close out these two episodes on. And it makes me think, I just finished writing a message that I'm going to speak at a couple of churches in the coming months. And when I was praying about what God wanted me to say, and this idea of how all of this chaos is going on in our world, God led me to this thought one morning in my quiet time. And the thought was this, that he said, and I just get these impressions of God speaking. I don't know if he speaks audibly to me, but I just get these very clear impressions. It's all from the moment I met him at 16, it's never changed. And I would say that it is almost like God is speaking out loud to me, although I don't think that there's an audible voice. But what God said to me that morning, I was sitting in this room right now in this chair, just doing some quiet time and contemplating God. And he said to me, Carole, you have become a consumer, not a cultivator. And a consumer goes out and just consumes everything.
Right.
Like you're consuming barbecue, you're
Sure.
consuming sweet tea, you're consuming key lime pie, which I love all of those things.
Mhm.
And when I go to Memphis in a few months, I'm going to probably have to go and do all of those three things. Well, maybe not the sweet tea. We'll see. But when we talk about being consumer, there's no purpose. We're not building it up. We're consuming,
Mhm.
consuming.
It's about us.
It's about us.
Right.
But when we become a cultivator, then we start to look at the pain and we start to look at the suffering and we start to look at the reason Rebecca is running this race.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we're cultivating our relationship with God. We're using that to cultivate others'
Sure.
relationships. We're using all of that. And I think that's why we keep going back and doing it over and over and over. And I just spent a month in Milwaukee sleeping on a couch because my family needed me.
Mhm.
And it was a hard month. But why did I do it?
Cultivating.
Because I'm
That's
cultivating.
right.
So let's talk for these last few minutes about how God uses suffering to ...
Okay.
He
Sure.
builds character and strengthens faith.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things, this, I like different crafts and all sorts of other stuff, and I get into all sorts of things. And a while ago, I did some forging with some metal and stuff. And it's interesting when you heat metal up, when you heat steel up, you can shape it, you can move it around and all sorts of other stuff. But then if you just let it cool, but you don't heat treat it after that, if you don't temper it, it's very, very brittle. It looks
Really? I
great.
didn't.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
I mean, you can take well, it would be this is probably maybe a bad illustration, but well, it's not really a bad illustration. It's like a file, a metal
Okay.
file. I don't mean a
Yeah.
fingernail file, like a metal file.
Yeah, like a metal file.
Is very, very, very hard.
Yeah.
That's why you can file stuff with it, because it's
Absolutely.
harder than the other metal. But it has not been tempered. So if you take a file and let's say you can grind it against and you can use it to remove metal or remove wood from something else. But if you to take a hammer and hit that file hard enough, it won't bend. It just shatters. It'll just break.
Wow.
Because it hasn't been tempered. And
I like this.
And one of the ways that you temper it is that you heat it up and then you let it go through a cycle of cooling, and you heat it up again, and you keep it at this cycle, this thermocycling as it's called. You put it through this thermocycle and you change the very crystalline structure of that steel, and it becomes resilient. It's still hard, but now it's flexible.
I love that.
In the fire of adversity, that's what God does. He's developing character. He's developing our strength, because we may look great on the outside, but if we've never been through that adversity and that difficulty, we don't have that. We don't have it. We don't have the strength. I remember reading a story. I don't remember who had related it, but it was out toward your area. I think it was out toward California. Years ago, someone had some citrus groves, and they were there was a drought that hit, and which I think it's pretty common out there,
In
right?
California.
You have droughts, right? But
Yeah,
this
we
was
have
years.
droughts.
Yeah, this was years ago. Everybody else's citrus trees, they were dying, and this one guy, his were fine. And when they asked him what's going on, because they're still getting the same amount of water, he said when they were young, he withheld water from them to make their roots get deeper. And everybody else, their trees, their roots were not deep enough. And he says, this way, I intentionally stressed them when they were young by not allowing them to get as much water as I normally would give them to force their roots to grow deep. And so in the same way, God God does just that. This is in James chapter 1, verse 2. Count it all joys, my brothers. Count it all joy, my brothers. Now, just that phrase itself just sounds bizarre. When you meet trials of various kinds. I don't remember the last time I experienced a great trial, and I was like, I'm just rejoicing in this. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, that is, mature and complete, lacking in nothing. And so that's what happens. Peter, 1 Peter 1:6. In this you rejoice. Same thing that James is saying. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so it builds character, it strengthens faith. And when we avoid that pain, and let me just say, if we can rightly, morally, in a good way, avoid pain, yeah, I mean, you should. We don't need to court it. Life is painful enough without, I saw a quote that's been going around on the, as one of the memes here lately. It's like, life is hard, and it's harder if you're stupid, right? It's hard as it is. Life is pain. We could say life is painful. It's even more painful if you make foolish decisions. So it's painful enough if you're a wise person and making wise biblical decisions, much less if you're making foolish decisions. It's going to be even more painful. But if you can rightly avoid it, then you do so. But for the pain that comes, it develops character in us as we go through it.
I remember the morning I wrote my whole book on this passage in James. It's so funny that you brought that up, because the morning after I left my husband in the psychiatric hospital, I opened up my scripture, and that's the first scripture I turned to. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. And the first thing, I slammed the Bible shut, and here I'm having this conversation with God, and I'm saying to him, are you kidding me? I'm looking for comfort. I'm looking for peace. I'm looking for hope. I'm looking for anything except for I'm supposed to be joyful and happy. And then I went back and looked at it in the message, the message parallel. It's not a translation.
Right.
It's a paraphrase. And it says, and your faith life will be on display. It says, consider it all joy when, not if, when. And then the reasoning is your faith life will be on display for all to see. And all of a sudden, I latched on to this idea that I was going to get through this, not get out of it, that I was going to continue to walk in this pain.
Sure.
Because there was a purpose. And I do believe that my faith life is so much stronger today than what it was prior to this experience.
Sure.
And I think the other thing that it shows, which is the next point, that it humbles us and it shows us that we have to depend on God, because at that moment, I didn't have anywhere to turn. I didn't know who to call. I didn't have Rebecca in my life to say, come help, come. I mean, I did not have at that moment, I didn't know what to do. And so my dependence had to be face down on the floor on him.
Absolutely.
Because I didn't have any other way.
Sure. Well, and you find that you find that God puts us in situations and circumstances to allow us to experience that dependence. And we find that oft-quoted verse found originally in Habakkuk, and then it circulates through the New Testament about the just shall live by faith.
Yes.
The righteous person shall live by faith. We tend to emphasize the faith part, which understandably. But then there's the verb, the just shall live by faith. So everything we do, every aspect of our life is to be wrapped up in that faith. We live by that faith. And so there is an element of utter and complete dependence that we see. We should be able to see that on a day-to-day basis, but in the midst of suffering, we really see that. One of my go-to passages whenever I've experienced pain in the past and even in the present is Psalm 77. I go to Psalm 77. I read Psalm 77 a lot. It's a psalm of Asaph, We don't know exactly what he's going through. We just know it's bad. And I love this. I love this grammatical switch that takes place. He starts out in verse 1. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. He's not sleeping. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Then I said, I will appeal to this, the years of the right hand of the Most High. And then here's what happens. He's been talking about all in these first verses. It's in the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand. This is the whole consumer thing, right?
The consumerism.
My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled. I cannot speak. I consider the days of old. Let me remember my song in the light. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. And then you get down to verse 11, and there's a shift.
Yeah.
There's a shift. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. So he reaches this point in his thinking. I'm going to remember the years of the Most High. I'm going to remember the faithfulness of God. And then his focus shifts from me, my, I, to you, your. And he understands his dependence upon this God, because his suffering is viewed through a God-focused lens rather than a self-focused lens. If you focus it upon yourself, it's never going to make sense. It's just going to lead you to deeper despair.
Oh, absolutely. I'm constantly reminding myself, when I start to go through the narrative in my mind, I can tell when I'm starting to cycle down by the narrative that's going into my life. Why is this happening to me? I didn't sign up for this. I don't deserve this. This is not fair. All of those statements start circling in my mind. And the minute that happens, I stop, because I realize my focus is on me and my pain and not on God, which leads us to the next point, which is, I have come to understand, and I brought this up a little bit when I talked about James, when he says in the message, and your faith life will be on display for all to see. More than my faith life, what I believe people see when they look at my journey, and they start to hear how God did this and God did this and God did this, is that he is bringing glory to himself.
Yes.
He is revealing more about his character and his power, and how much he loves us and wants to be in relationship with us. I mean, go back to the picture of, we talked about, I think last week, in Genesis, where Adam and Eve are in the garden and they get kicked out. Well, they didn't follow the one rule God set up. There was consequences. He put them out into suffering and pain, but he spends the entire rest of the scripture trying to restore that relationship and show his power and character.
Absolutely.
And so I kind of answered that for you. Sorry.
No, that's great. Because when people say, why doesn't God do something about human suffering?
Yeah.
He did.
He did.
He sent Christ to die for our sins. He did the ultimate.
Yeah.
He addressed the very root cause of all of our suffering. He did.
Yeah.
So when someone says, well, why doesn't God do something? He's done the greatest thing.
Well, he kind of made sense of it all.
Yes.
I mean, if you don't look at it through the lens of God and who he is, his character and his power, it's not going to make sense.
Sure.
But if you do, then all of a sudden, I feel like it kind of comes back into focus.
Well, and I think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No,
I'm talking over
go
you.
ahead.
No. And I think that that's what happens. We start adopting this wrong view of it
Mm-hmm.
when we are focused more upon our physical, mental, emotional pain, which I'm not detracting from it. It's
Right.
real, it's
I
heavy,
agree.
it's
Yes.
a burden.
So
It
heavy.
will crush you
Mm-hmm.
without the strength that's offered through Christ. But we focus more upon that as the problem than our sin before a holy God being the problem. And
Mm-hmm.
so we always ask God, why are you a good God? Why would you allow this suffering in
Yeah.
my life? We seldom ask the question, good holy God, how does my sin grieve your heart? We don't ask that.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of
Right.
what kind of what kind of grief do I bring you, God, because of my sin? No, no, no. It's always like, well, God, I mean, you should be doing something about this. And he does it for his glory. But our
Yes.
suffering is not going to make any sense if it's not attached to ultimately the glory of God. It's not going to make sense.
Right.
It
Right.
won't have a
Which
purpose.
right. Which brings us to the last point
Hmm.
of how God uses suffering too. And that is it points our minds and hearts towards the expectation of the coming restoration, that ultimate goal of living with him
Yes,
in heaven when everything is made perfect and
absolutely.
we're no longer a sinful creature.
Oh, and when people have talked to me about this before with my preaching and my writing, I had a buddy of mine. He told me this. He said, "You know that pastors have certain themes that they keep revisiting." And I said, "I've never really thought about that, but I mean, and I'm
Hmm.
just thinking biblically. Well,
Yeah.
sure." And he said, "No." He said, "You know what one of yours is?" And I said, "Well, I'm a little afraid to ask,
Yeah.
but okay." He said, "Restoration." He said,
Yeah.
"You talk so much about how God is currently restoring the universe and bringing it back toward his
Mm,
ultimate goal of everything being united in Christ, and how he is
yeah.
restoring things by the power of Jesus." And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Yeah, but I don't think you understand how much you talk about that." And I said,
Hmm.
"Well, maybe I don't, really think through every time I'm saying it, but yeah, it's on my mind a lot because we live in a
Hmm.
broken world." I,
Yeah.
I love I love this. This is, I mean, creation one day is going to be restored to its glorious state, right? And you have in Revelation 21:4.
Mm,
And this is future. I mean, this is
yeah.
for the whole prosperity gospel thing. This is something that is future tense. It will
Right.
happen, not here and
Yeah.
now. We
Not
get
today.
glimpses of it here and now, but
Right.
never in the fullness. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no
Mm,
more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. So this is this very idea that the the presence of suffering,
hmm.
it highlights not only human sinfulness
Yeah.
and human depravity, but it also highlights the hope presented and the
Yes.
sacrifice of Christ
Yes.
made upon the very behalf of that
Hmm.
sinfulness, and the rest that is found only in him. So when we see pain and we say, "Oh, this pain, it's so heavy, it's so burdensome," yes. Uh,
Yes.
I think it was C.S. Lewis again. We mentioned him in the first episode, but C.S. Lewis that said that um, pain is a megaphone to the world, and it shouts out, "There's something terribly wrong with the world, and
Hmm.
the world needs redemption." And you look at every worldview, we
Hmm.
always talk about that, answers, it has to answer the questions: where do we come from?
Right.
What's wrong with the world? How can what's wrong with the world be made right? And then what does the
Hmm.
future hold, right? And we have other
Hmm.
subsets of that. But every worldview recognizes there's something wrong with the world. And then every worldview has an answer to how how do
Yeah.
we do something about it? What is the solution for what is wrong with the world? And we would
Hmm.
say, what's wrong with the world? Sin.
Right.
um,
Correct.
what's wrong with the world is not human pain, human
Mm-mm.
injustice. Those are results of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Because of sin, we try to dethrone God, we devalue humanity, who's made in the image of God. But our major issue is not human pain. The major issue
Right.
is our sin before a holy God. And what did
Yeah.
God do? He sent Jesus
Yeah.
to die in our place, and he took his the wrath of God upon himself, and then was
Uh,
buried and rose again to show the sacrifice was fully sufficient. It was once for all, and God was satisfied with it. Didn't have to be repeated. And so
right.
God did something, and now God is in the process of doing that, of
Yeah.
redeeming even our worst days. I mean, the absolute worst day that Jesus experienced, the darkest day of history,
Yeah.
gives us the only hope in our darkest, hardest
Oh,
moments and seasons of life.
absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Dustin, thank you. Thank you for
Thank
these
you.
2 episodes. Thank you for just just sharing who you are in God and what God has put on your heart. And I know your first book, we talked about this a little bit last week. Your first book is coming out in November. So tell us again just a little bit about your
Sure.
book and how people can stay connected to
All
you.
right. November 12th, 2024. We're having the release of my first book. It's called Before Dawn, Knowing God's Presence in the Dark Seasons of Life. And it covers a lot of things we have covered. Some of the things I mentioned in this podcast, or you'll probably find between those covers, but it will come out then. We'll have more details on the website and everything
Mm-hmm.
about how to order. It'll be available on Amazon. And the if you want to keep track, you want to kind of follow along, I've written a good bit over the years, just some blog posts and some random thoughts for a number of years now at dustincgeorge.com. And I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, though, Dustin C. George. If you just type that in, you should be able to find me. I do post some theological things from time to time, some theological thoughts. I was looking back over it the last couple of days. I just find that I post mostly food and our dog. That's for
Oh, yes,
whatever.
food. Well, Jasper's
Two
so
great
cute.
loves there.
Yeah, Jasper's
He
adorable.
is a good boy.
Well, I will put all of the contact information for you in the show notes, and I'm excited for your book to come out. I did get to preview it.
Thank you for that.
I'm just so blessed, and I just love the way your mind thinks, and so thank you for taking time to help us unpack this conversation.
Thank you.
Now, I like to close every show. You know where I'm going
I
because I
do
did
know
this
where you're
last
going.
week, so you're gonna have to tell me. I'm huge on caretaking, and so last week you were gonna sit on the deck and maybe do some leather work and
Yeah.
sit on the deck and without your phone and do nothing and just kind of enjoy the cicadas.
Right.
Which a friend of mine in North Carolina or South Carolina sent me a recording of the cicadas because we don't have those in California.
Oh.
And then I went and looked up what a cicada is. And I was like, I don't know if I could enjoy this noise as much now that I've seen what it actually
Yeah.
looks
It
like. It's
reminds me
kind
of
of
my childhood down in the South when I would hear
but
them.
it's beautiful. It's a beautiful,
It
relaxing
can
noise.
be in certain doses. In certain doses. I mean, and haven't we all felt like climbing a tree and just screaming at the top of our lungs all day long from
Yeah.
time to time? So I
Yes.
can't fault them, right? They've been in
I
the
may
dark for a number of years.
I may have in my childhood
I
done
might
just
have done that
exactly
too.
that. Climbed to the top of a tree and screamed. So Dustin, what are you going to do in the next 24 hours to take care of you?
Probably in the next 24 hours, I'm going to find some time. There's a coffee house you've been to here in
Vienna.
Maryville, Tennessee, Vienna Coffee House.
Vienna coffee.
I I take many vacations to Vienna, the coffee house, not
Yeah.
Austria. But that's not really a mini vacation. I'll be back. I'm headed to Austria for the afternoon. But
Yeah.
I take little mini vacations, and they have this great patio out back
Yes.
that looks out over a little creek called Pistol Creek. It's running
Yep.
right down through the middle of downtown. And
Know exactly
I
where it is.
will get a coffee, and I will go and I will either sit out on the patio, or they have some leather chairs in there that I love that actually um, that little area was where I wrote a good portion of the things that I've written over the years. We're
I
snuggled up
love
in a
it.
corner there. So my plan is I'm going to take at some point in time in the next 24 hours a little mini vacation to Vienna, the coffee house, not the city, and drink some coffee and just be still.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you for joining me today and for encouraging the caregivers who are listening. This idea of suffering is one that's really hard for us to unpack and comprehend.
Mm.
And so I just pray and hope that as you have listened to these episodes, that maybe it has given you a little bit more clarity, a little bit more comfort, a little more understanding of what suffering looks like and the purpose that God has in it. And I appreciate each of you who listen. Our journey as caretakers can be really hard, and we can get caught up in so many chaotic emotions. And I know that my caretaking is on overload right now. And there are mornings where I get out of bed and I'm just thankful that I don't have a text message or a voicemail from an assisted living nurse that's telling me my mom's having a problem. And I know that there's a tendency to isolate and feel alone. And I want you to hear me when I say this, caregivers, that you're not alone. There's 55 million of us in the US. And yes, that means I'm one, you're one. There's so many of us. That means we're not alone. And if you would like to know more about my personal caretaking journey, the links to my website, social media, and my book, Are You Ready to Find Joy When Life Gets Messy, will be in the show notes as well. And I will be back next week for another meaningful conversation about what the caretaker's journey looks like. And until then, it's all about Him.